Nacionales y cobertura de prensa mundial. Para esta ponencia del doctor Charles Brannan vamos a contar con traducción simultánea, entonces los invitamos a que escuchemos muy atentamente lo que nos trae el doctor Brannan.
Hello, and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Or is there an echo?
Perfect, and we can see you too. We can see
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor Restrepo, for the introduction, and following some outstanding speakers. So it's just a pleasure to be part of this wonderful conversation. And can you see these slides okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant. So I was going to talk today, and I know we're a little behind on time, so I was going to talk on community structures and the importance of community structures to reduce violence, but a particular form of violence that I know challenges the Americas overall, including Colombia, but also the United States very much so, and that is gun violence. So in the United States, 2010 was a quite a watershed year, a very important year in the United States, sadly important year, in that it was the first year in United States history that we had one firearm per person in the U.S. The growth of our firearms has been quite extensive. Firearms are created at a higher rate than people in the United States, and they live much longer than people in the United States. And if you take this out into the future, you can see by 2050, firearms and guns in the United States will far outpace our people. So, and in fact, extending this even further, the United States, which is also the greatest producer of firearms on the planet, has more guns than the next 25 highest nations combined. So the firearm issue in the United States is quite extensive. And we also, when compared to other developed nations, we have a firearm death rate that is 25 times their average. So many firearms and many firearm deaths and injuries, and quite a bit of firearm violence. And so our group at Columbia and in other universities at the United States and with our government agencies, we've asked the question of what can we do about this growth in firearms? And we asked this, I don't know how this will translate, but who has better ideas than this in terms of controlling our firearm violence problem in the United States? Now, when you ask this question about how to control firearm violence, probably the first answer that most people will provide is more police. And that is one approach. to addressing firearm violence, but I want to offer you some of the limitations of more policing. First off, it has a short-term effect, a short-term impact. That is, police may have an effect on firearm violence and violence in general while they are present. But as this graph shows, once police leave an area, the firearm violence, in blue here, the firearm violence will simply return. So the blue is very high. Once the police are here, the gun violence does go down, but as the police again leave that area, the gun violence comes back to the amount that it was before the police were there. So the other thing about policing is that it is quite expensive. In the United States, the vast majority of our cities, the top line item, they spend more of their budget on policing than anything else. And as we've been seeing, certainly has come to light in the U.S. news this past couple of years, but has been there for quite some time, for decades. An overuse of policing can certainly erode trust in communities. So policing is one answer that perhaps is something that we have relied on, but maybe we need more of a balance to a first reliance on policing. The other is gun laws in the United States. And our gun laws, in many cases, this is work that the Rand Corporation in Los Angeles did. And what you see here is that gun laws in the United States are very difficult to pass in the first place. But also gun laws, we're either uncertain about whether they have an effect on actual gun violence, or when we have had the opportunity to study them, most of them do not show an effect. Some do. Things like child access prevention laws seem to have a certain amount of support for them, but most gun laws in the US seem to have either a minimal effect or no effect, or we simply do not know the impact. And so this led some of our group to ask this question of how do we go beyond gun laws, beyond laws and law enforcement, to really begin to think about other opportunities to prevent gun violence in the United States. And by the way, this extends beyond the United States. I want to frame this in an international context, that this extends beyond the United States. I've worked in Central America, for instance, in Guatemala and Honduras, where the gun homicide problem is enormous. So there is definitely work elsewhere in the Americas, and we've just begun work in Guyana, where the gun suicide problem is a major issue, a top issue for that nation. So we really do need to begin to think beyond just simply laws and law enforcement, and that is not to offset those, but we need other solutions in addition, other innovative solutions and interventions. And so one of these that has been getting much more scientific investment and study over the past years are community engaged solutions to gun violence. And these have been studied to some extent, and they are unsung. That is, most people don't think that these sorts of community solutions are having an impact, but indeed they are. And over 20 years, for every 10 of these programs, there's something like a 6 to 9% reduction in violence. And I want to talk specifically, there are some programs that involve what are called interrupters, that is, individuals who will go into the community and interrupt gun violence, the same way you would send individuals to go into a community and interrupt COVID or other infectious disease transmission. These interrupters seek to treat gun violence. But then there are programs that also treat the basic structures that cause the gun violence in the first place. And these include things like jobs programs that have been shown to be very successful. And then I want to focus on programs that change places, place-based interventions that actually have quite a big shift on basic structures and communities and do have a large effect on gun violence. These are structures in the United States. We have a terrible connection between our history of racism, the disinvestment in communities, meaning communities that lose funds, and then the subsequent abandonment of these communities. And this has led to rampant spaces, a great many spaces like this that you see in these pictures in the United States in our cities. And if you add up spaces, the land area of spaces that look like this in the United States, it adds up to an area the size of the country of Switzerland. So this is a massive situation, these vacant and abandoned spaces in the United States. It is a major challenge, but we'd like to think of it also as now an opportunity to have an impact on gun violence and other forms of violence in the United States by directly treating these places and spaces that are abandoned and vacant like this. So I also have to say that our work in this space, thinking about abandoned places and what we can do with them, comes from the communities themselves. There was a time when we asked that same question of what are we going to do about this very large gun violence problem in our cities to the communities themselves, and they pointed over and over again back to vacant land, vacant lots, and abandoned buildings in their cities that had grown into the millions of these spaces. And this was something that they said if they could make a change to their neighborhoods and their communities, they would address these vacant and abandoned spaces first. And this has also come to light recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, where this was a Washington Post editorial that was written by one of my colleagues, that it said that if Black lives really matter, we must invest in Black neighborhoods. And in general, in disinvested and underrepresented neighborhoods that have suffered from structural racism in the United States. Now, our work has gone to look at this, and over a good decade now, we've managed to look at what happens if you make changes to abandoned land and abandoned buildings here, as you can see them at the top and the bottom of the screen, and you make the abandoned land into new green space, new green areas, and you change these abandoned buildings to make them cleaner and more inviting so that perhaps someone could live in them. And what we found is that gun violence goes down by a very significant amount, by as much as 39%. And that for every $1 invested in these, there are literally hundreds of dollars in return, because gun violence is a very expensive event for a city to respond to, and for families. And the general tragedy of it, actually, when you translate it into pain and suffering in dollars, it is a very, very expensive thing. So small, inexpensive investments in abandoned places and spaces can have quite a return. I will say that we have then taken this work and done it in an experimental format. This is one city in the United States, Philadelphia, where 600 vacant lots were selected, and a percentage of them were assigned, a third of them were assigned to a full cleaning and greening and maintenance group, and then others were assigned to control groups. And what we found is that gun violence in this case, after a true randomized experiment, went down again by a significant amount, by 17%, after this greening intervention. And we call this win-win science. That is, the science here not only generates knowledge about what works in communities and what can then be taken from one city and moved to another, but it also provides those communities with resources. And in fact, gun violence went down in these communities, but also did other nuisances and challenges that communities were facing. And the co-benefits of, as people became less fearful to go out in their communities because the gun violence went down, they then went outside more and were able to relax in a more stress-free environment. And they also reported less depression and other mental health challenges after the treatment of these spaces with the new greening and the treatment of the buildings. New York City has done something similar. by adding in, again, this is a place-based intervention. They've added in lighting in a randomized trial in New York City, and they're expanding this to other areas, and they found that violence and crime has gone down by 36% by simply adding new street lights. The street lights are going to not be temporary anymore. And this is something, again, a place-based change of a basic structure that people expect that has had an impact in reducing violence and gun violence in New York City. And then finally, we have other randomized trials or experiments in various cities, again, in Philadelphia and New Orleans, but also now in Detroit and in Newark and other cities with buildings and buildings and land. And some of the earliest findings here is that gun violence goes down and stays down, by the way, for years after buildings are converted into this cleaned and greened and made ready for the possibility that someone might live in them in the future. So I don't have a whole lot more to say other than to tell you that addressing these basic structures, such as changes to places through research and actual programs that make changes to places, whether that be new green spaces, whether that be fixing buildings, adding lighting, or in fact planting trees. What we found in a host of cities that we've done some of the work, as have others, that the reduction in gun violence is anywhere from as much as 6% to 56% when you do address these basic structures in cities. So I will leave you with these few take-home points. And I think these are more broadly, and some of the other speakers touched on this, but these are broader public health points that we really do need to think more closely about, not just as a public health community, but to make this message clear to others outside our community, including the public and policymakers. The first point is that programs that focus on places or changes to basic structures can have a much greater influence on the lives of more people for longer periods of time than simply focusing on programs that think only about treating individuals, okay? So we do need to take a much more universal approach and get our colleagues outside of public health to begin to think about this. And then an accompanying thought is that we should not expect, if we are doing individually based programs, whether they be medical programs or police-based programs, we should stop thinking that these programs are going to have a sustained impact if we keep putting people back into places, spaces, and structures that are chaotic and unhealthy. Our individual treatments simply will not work until we change the basic structures that are generating the poor health and the lack of safety in the first place. And with that, my final point is that changing places and these basic structures, they can be place-based, they can be basic economic structures. These are important for us to consider as standalone treatments or standalone interventions, and they needn't be complex or expensive to have a very large impact on the public's health. And with that, I'll finish and happy to have continued conversations with you. And thank you again very much so for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Have some questions for you. And we have some questions for you before we finished. The first question is about these interventions. We know that gun violence have a lot of effect or is related also with domestic violence. When you have this kind of intervention in the environment, how much this impact the domestic violence that is caused also for gun violence? That's the first question.
Sure. So I do think that it's a great question, and we haven't, domestic violence is very interesting. Domestic violence is almost by definition is typically something that mostly occurs indoors. Much of the outcomes we've looked at in terms of violence and gun violence have been street-based and outdoor outcomes. However, we have begun to look a little bit at domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and we think there is some effect. But to be honest with you, we have not fully studied that yet. But I appreciate the question because it's definitely a question that many people are asking right now.
Okay, the other question is about how you decide which places or what kind of interventions are applied to each city or each place. You have some community approach, or you work with other co-workers or architectures or policymakers, or how you decide this kind of intervention?
Interestingly, I have worked with architects and landscape architects and other folks like that, but everything that I showed you today, I truly meant that they were community initiated. These are things that communities created themselves in a small way, and somehow we were made aware of them and were able to test them in a slightly larger way before they got applied to entire cities. And when I say communities tried these out in a small way, most of the time, we're talking about communities that are often deeply impoverished communities and communities that are suffering from decades of gun violence. And effectively, most communities are trying these sorts of interventions because they, I don't know what words to use here, because they are fed up. They don't know what else to do. They are very exasperated. I hope that translates well. And they didn't know what else to do, and they basically tried something and noticed on a small scale that these changes to places and spaces seemed to have an effect in the immediate area. And then they thought, well, maybe we should be attempting this instead of just our neighborhood. We might attempt it in other neighborhoods as well. So these are all community initiated approaches.
Okay, and our last question is about the interrupters. You talk a little about the interrupters, and we want to learn a little more how this program works and the interrupters, what strategies they are using.
Yeah, I didn't talk as much about the interrupters for a few reasons. Let me tell you about it first. So I do truly mean that the interrupters, and for those of you who want to learn more about it, you can Google it, and there is a fantastic documentary about the first interrupters program in the city of Chicago, which is called The Interrupters. And if nothing else, go watch the trailer for that documentary because it's very moving. So the idea behind interrupters is, it is an epidemiologic idea. It was begun by an epidemiologist. And the idea is that violence is something that is contagious, particularly things like gang violence and things of that nature, and that there's a cycle of violence that is going on. And if you can interrupt it the same way you would interrupt the transmission of COVID, if you send individuals into communities, basically the way you would send testing and tracing individuals into communities, it's exactly the same concept, but for the prevention of violence. Now, for violence prevention, those interrupters have to be what are called credible messengers. They need to be individuals that are seen as authentic in that community, are from the community, and have suffered, frankly, have been part of the violence at one point in their life. The vast majority of interrupters have suffered from it. And so they are basically credible and are able to get access to and talk to people who are participating in the violence in ways that others cannot, including, by the way, the way the police cannot. And those programs for certain cities have been shown to be quite successful. So I think that's, I hope that answers the question. And if there are more questions about that, I'd be happy to send you more reading about or things to see. But you should watch the documentary to give you a real on-the-ground sense of how these interrupters programs work. And they are wonderful. Their challenge, frankly, is keeping the money flowing for them. It's costly to keep these interrupters programs functional. And that's one of the reasons that we decided to think about places as opposed to person-based interventions all the time. interrupters programs are wonderful, but once the money runs out, the impact of the program, it's challenging to keep it sustained.
Okay, Charlie, we don't have any more questions. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for your intervention. You are amazing as always, and see you soon.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Dr. Jason, thanks again for your time from Facultad de Salud Pública. We thank you a lot. Now you can begin with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen and we hear you perfectly.
Okay, I'm not able to advance. Okay, I hope you can see now still. Yes?
Yes, we can see. Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
Okay, thank you again, and thank you to the organizers, Gustavo and Eliana Martinez and others for inviting me and having me here. I wish I could be with you in Medellin. Lo siento, hablaré en inglés. So I'll say some things about a bigger global picture of thinking about cities for life, planning for health and sustainability, and make a few points that hopefully we can talk more about in the session. So thinking about cities as places of not just the built environment, but of course they must be for people and all people, and investing in communities and places and people at the same time is really a key. Cities must eliminate inequalities between communities and different population groups. And key issues that challenge us globally are racism and spatial segregation, challenge health. COVID-19 has contributed to policies that we've seen that are still with us, some are not with us, that have separated us more than ever. So we must think about how to reverse this and reinvest in social connections. And to do this, community residents must be seen as planners, as innovators, as key participants, and we must value their ideas and expertise before sometimes smart technologies. And when we talk about getting to zero, we must, I think, focus as much on the qualities and how inclusive our places are and how much they promote connection. And I'll give you, I hope, some examples of these ideas. So we are on an urban planet, but an increasingly unequal planet in those cities. And as we urbanize, more and more populations are living in informal settlements, in barrios, that have little access to services and create more inequality. So how do we address this inequality while we urbanize? Latin America and Caribbean remains one of the most unequal places, especially for informality in our cities. And women and youth are particularly at risk of this informality. So low income neighborhoods are most vulnerable to injury and death, and this is globally. But particularly in Latin America, 60% of roads in Latin American Caribbean cities have no sidewalks. And I know that's a challenge also in Medellin. 88% of roads have no controlled pedestrian crossings or facilities to make these safer crossings. So I know this is a focus of this session and much of what the panelists may talk about. But also our COVID policies have in some cases made this challenge worse for the urban poor and informal communities. This is an example from some of our work and some of our partners in Nairobi, Kenya, where the police in the early lockdowns, enforcing curfews in Nairobi, killed more young people than COVID did. And over 120,000 slum residents were arrested for curfew violations and put in jail in the name of public health in Manila and in Cebu City in the Philippines. So are our public health policies helping the poor the most? These lockdowns also hurt the poor, while many elites who could stay home benefited. This is just some examples from Dhaka, Bangladesh, the informal settlements there, where almost the entire slum population reports greater income and food insecurity now during the COVID lockdowns and in this in some cases, post-lockdown period. There were 70% more deaths from suicide than died from COVID-19 in the year from March 2020 to March 2021 of this past year. So really, what are our policies doing, particularly for the urban poor? And many of those suicides, unfortunately, were women. And the burden on women should not be ignored as we think about our hopefully new urban policies. People with disabilities have been left behind in many informal communities and informal settlements in our COVID policies. This is also some work that we have done in Nairobi, Kenya, to make more inclusive cities. And UNICEF, the UN agency, this past year really asked if whether public health has failed in some cases in these policies. So noting that decades of work on children's health, food security, gender rights, and poverty alleviation were reversed through many COVID-19 policies, well-intended policies probably, but had very detrimental impacts on the poor, women, and particularly children. Estimates of 6 to 7 million more children may die from acute malnutrition. To put that also into context, about 250,000 children under 18 years old died last year, or almost every year, unfortunately, from lack of sanitation. These are mostly diarrheal diseases and parasitic infections. But as of about a month ago, the UN estimates that about less than 9,000, 8,700 children have died from COVID-19 globally. So where are we putting our energies? Where are we focusing in public health today and now moving forward? But there are important examples of community-driven innovation that were already happening, and some were raised up during this pandemic and crisis. You're seeing women doing food security, cooking food to keep people fed in the Philippines outside of Manila. And on the right is a community mapping project in Rio de Janeiro by a group called Catalytic Communities to really document who was most impacted, recognizing that the urban poor are often not counted in many databases. And we must acknowledge that some of these solutions are what we need to build on as public health professionals, policymakers, that many of our solutions and solutions for our most urgent urban health and inequality challenges today are already being practiced by the urban poor. There's a lot of literature now documenting that in India, a slum, one of the largest in Asia called Dharavi, that the residents there created what's now being seen as a global model for management of COVID-19. And much of those strategies, or many of those strategies, focused on the basics of health: water, sanitation, social connection, energy, services, supporting youth and women. So we need to look at these as important models, not just what we're doing in epidemiology and engineering and other disciplines. So what are some ways forward? Thinking about our streets, our sidewalks as the arteries of life, social spaces, not just mobility spaces, involving residents and paying them to actually do some of this new design and implementation work, focusing on universal design so that no one is left behind, greater attention to supporting health, not just stopping disease, and health being the things that really are critical to make us and everyone healthy, from food to livelihoods and economic opportunity to social connection. So getting back to those basics rather than focusing just on one disease or one behavior or one exposure in our communities. So thinking about streets and sidewalks as the arteries and veins of a city that give it life, not just about mobility. There are opportunities to reduce stress, to support relationships, and strengthen core life skills, particularly for children and young people. And I know some of this is already happening in Medellin. Involving residents as co-designers and paying them to implement. Here are some strategies or some examples. One from Fortaleza in Brazil, around a school where the school kids redesigned the streets, painted it, and created more play space. Another example from Brazil, an unsafe stairway. And I know in Medellin you have many examples like this. And here's where community members, youth in particular, used a game to redesign this stairway and make it more safe, more fun, more accessible. So thinking about social inclusion in our public spaces, age-friendly spaces, and more than just mobility, but opportunities for social interaction and places to pause and engage with others. And social inclusion is more than just design. To think about who's excluded and who's most vulnerable, here's the percent of Afro-descendant populations living in informal settlements in Latin America. And we can see across almost every country, Afro-descendants more likely to live in informal settlements, again, with all of those extra risks and challenges than non-Afro-descendant populations. And also living in poverty. So we must ask who are the most advantaged today and how can we invest in those communities and those populations. I'll give you one last quick example from where I'm sitting today in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, a city called Richmond, California, which is within the Bay Area metropolitan region near San Francisco. 10, 15 years ago, this was a city with the lowest life expectancy, the highest disease rates, and the ninth most violent city in the United States, largely from gun homicides. And so we began with residents and community partners and the city to ask, how can we help transform this into a healthy, more equitable place? And I'll give you just a few quick examples of what we did. The first was to start with community residents, many who were immigrants, many who were non-English speakers, asking what makes this community healthy or what could make this community healthy. So identifying both assets within families, within communities, within neighborhoods, but also those things that are also stressors in public health and policy. Too often, we focus on risks, but not on assets as much. Over the last 10 or 15 years, we've integrated multiple plans, not just small projects. And we have a climate action plan, but part of that plan is also health equity called Health in All Policies strategy. We have a pedestrian, greening, and bicycle plan. We have an economic development plan. And all of these are linked through both performance indicators and the city's budget. So we're not doing planning for green space or for bicycle paths without also thinking about health and inclusion and economic opportunities at the same time. Let me give you one example of how we did that or how we're doing that. So one key challenge was what we call energy poverty. This is also known as the poverty penalty, where the poor often pay more for basic services, their utilities in many parts of the world, including in the United States, for energy, for water, things like that. So the city initiated a program called Richmond Build, which is a city-sponsored job training program for young people. And they get trained in electricity and solar power installation. You can see the images here. And it creates employment and skills for young people. It also improves the households where these are installed. These houses and buildings need structural improvements in order to take the solar energy. And it's all done for free because the utility recognizes that they can save money by generating new power on this household and not have to burn more oil or use up more energy to service the power grid. And there's been great benefits across multiple impacts. So it's reduced the poverty of households because they don't have to pay as much or anything actually for energy. They're selling energy back to the utility. It's improved health, in part because of economic status, but also improving the living structural conditions. And it's reduced local air pollution from a refinery that generates energy. And one example also of a neighborhood that sort of took back control and focused not just on place and mobility, but also on social connection. And this is a neighborhood called the Iron Triangle because it was bordered by railroad tracks on three sides. And it was the poorest and most violent and most vulnerable community. And young people organized to take back their community and wanted to focus on some parks that had been overrun and taken over by drug dealers and were unsafe. This was that park. It might look peaceful in this image, but it was really occupied day and night by dangerous activities. And young people literally took it back and did a research project to identify how could they redevelop this site and link it to the rest of the city. They came up with a dream called their community vision and involved residents, and that's the sketch you see on the left-hand side of gardens for food and places to play for all ages, for a kitchen, a community kitchen and bathrooms, many opportunities, barbecue spaces, ball playing, and even a zip line where you slide down all in this park. And they actually, instead of hiring outsiders or letting the city build it, they demanded that they get the resources to actually construct it themselves. And that's what you're seeing there on the right. And they were trained in construction and management and a whole host of skills that they now use. They've actually started a play equipment company to reproduce this model. And this is what the space looks like today. And it's not only rebuilt and redesigned by the community, but tens and tens of residents who live in the neighborhood work there. They get paid to maintain it, to run programs, to continually improve it, to provide food and education to young people in the neighborhood. So what are some lessons as I end here and let the others take off and be more specific in this session? Some of these lessons, back to what I said earlier about investing both in people and places at the same time. It should not be one or the other. Recognizing that residents are experts themselves. They have expertise to offer this process, and not just at the end to get their buy-in, but in the conceptualization and the design and the implementation. We can focus, and I know this is an idea from Medellin, on urban acupuncture, focused projects that can actually stimulate broader change, catalytic projects that can stimulate broader change across the entire city, focused on those most vulnerable communities first. So addressing those inequalities, particularly those spatial, economic inequalities, so that everyone can benefit. And then, of course, integrating these projects, these catalytic projects, social and built environment changes into broader city and regional plans, so that we know these can't happen in 1 or 2 years. These are long-range strategies, and it's a continual effort to invest and create and maintain healthy cities. Thank you.